I'd like to call our Town of Sydney Special Council meeting to order on Monday, August 14th at 6:40 p.m. And just note that Council has met as committee just previous to this meeting and had a regularly scheduled Committee of the Whole meeting. We do have a special Council meeting this evening following that Committee of the Whole meeting to deal with a specific item of business as indicated on the agenda, which we will come to. And so I'll call the meeting to order. Thank my colleagues, all members of council in the chamber, and thanks to members of staff in attendance, and to members of the public who are in attendance or watching the live web stream. I will briefly, while we did have a territorial acknowledgement in our previous meeting, as this is being recorded separately, I want to respectfully acknowledge that we are meeting in the territory of the Wasanich people this evening. And I would look for a motion to approve our agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded by Councillor Duck and Councillor Garnett. All in favor? The motion carries. Thank you. And we do have a special, we do have a public participation opportunity this evening. Public participation at a special council meeting has the intention of members of the public speaking to the special item of business on the agenda. And so I'll call for a first time if there's anyone wishing to come forward to speak to this evening's item. Good evening.
Good evening, Mayor Council. I'm speaking tonight in support of the 7-point housing action plan that has been developed by town staff. I commend them on the document. It sets out, I think, a clear, comprehensive plan that will hopefully allow the town to make significant progress in addressing our long-standing need for affordable housing. Little time is provided for public consultation, but given the August 18th deadline for submitting an application, I understand the need to move forward without delay. I note as well, in addition to possible funding from CMHC of $4.5 million, the town also has access to $3.6 million provided by the provincial government for housing initiatives, the $1 million in the amenity fund, and a possible access to $500,000 in the Build to Net Zero fund. This totals $9.6 million in support of this initiative. So with this funding, Sydney has the chance and the opportunity to provide real leadership in meeting this objective. I hope Council will move forward with this as soon as possible. I think it's great for the town, and I'm really pleased with this proposal. I want to thank staff again for a very good document, and so I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
And I should have acknowledged or asked at the beginning, I just want to acknowledge you, Denny Jelena, Sydney resident, for coming forward to speak.
Oh, I forgot my name. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll call for a second time. Please come forward. Good evening.
Good evening.
You can just pull the microphone a little bit if it helps.
Okay.
Or is less intimidating.
Right. Mine is just a very small point in this document. I read it, where you're going to give an incentive to people to build these units. In it you actually say that you could only get this funding if it's to be for a non-family member. I'd like to bring up the point that I have a nephew who has a disability. He's on disability pension, low income. Currently, we are helping to subsidize him live in a motel. He's actually in Calgary, but this is the example I want to extend. The amounts that you're offering here, a unit like this would be perfect for him. And it's very difficult for families to help subsidize somebody who's an adult. And we do that. This, I don't understand why you exclude family members. You know, because very often those are the very needy ones. I know my nephew is very needy. A unit like this would be perfect. And that amount of grant would certainly help a lot. So that's just one instance. There may be other families in the same situation. So if you're going to subsidize somebody who's going to make a profit out of this, why can't you subsidise somebody who's going to subsidise their family member? I mean, you can easily find out, you know, he's a low income. You could check his income, something like that. I mean, but, you know, something like this, a family member may be very willing to give that to virtually below. It would certainly be below rent. I mean, in my circumstance, if we were able to do that, it would be just covering the utilities, which would make a huge difference. So there must be other families in the same situation. So I think I would like you to consider that as an example.
Thank you for taking the time to bring your points forward. We will, after public participation, have staff provide an introduction. They may choose to speak to it at that time, but council will be then asking questions and having deliberations on this report, and I think we'll certainly speak to the points you've raised this evening, so thank you.
Okay, thank you.
If you could just perhaps just turn, pop the microphone for us. Thank you. And seeing no further, oh, sorry, ma'am, just for the record, I'm sorry, I didn't ask you to provide your name and that you're a Sydney resident. If you could just come forward and just say so into the mic. It's just the meeting's recorded. If you could just provide your name and where you reside, what municipality.
Okay, my name's Linda Jones and I live on Barrowbank Road.
Thank you very much.
Do you want my number?
No, that's.
In fact, you've both been to our door.
Thank you. Seeing no further speakers, I'll bring public participation to a close and thank those for coming forward this evening. And I'll now turn to our main item, which is the CMHC Housing Accelerator Fund grant application. And I'll turn to Mr. Newcomb, our Senior Manager, or Director.
Something or other. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
So yes, this is a report detailing a potential grant opportunity from the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. It's called the Housing Accelerator Fund Grant Program. It was only introduced a few months ago in early 2023, and its intent is to increase the rate of housing starts over and above sort of the background level to increase housing supply growth within Canadian communities. So staff have looked through the grant application, and we think there's some value in submitting an application. The main sort of component of the grant is this housing action plan, which requires a minimum of 7 initiatives. What staff have tried to do with these is build on policy directions in the OCP and the Economic Development Plan, to move in directions we're already going, just to kick those up a notch, essentially. So the grant program is a 3-year program, and what we're looking at is an additional 129 units expected over a baseline of 289 units. And these are just expected units based on averages from the past. Many things can affect these numbers, so they shouldn't be taken as gospel. And then the program has a set sort of funding formula, and based on the 129 units, there's certain unit types that would be a $4.5 million grant. So the way that staff have proposed to use this money in the Housing Action Plan is through 7 initiatives. Some are, I guess you could call them policy initiatives that would be delivered through the zoning bylaw. Some would be a little more concrete, like the first initiative, which would be purchasing some land and hopefully getting an affordable housing provider to construct a building on it. But essentially, as I said earlier, we're looking to sort of kick up to the next level policy initiatives that are already sort of in place in the town and move forward with some new programs and build on existing programs. So the grant program itself is not intended to be sort of a specific budgeted amount spent on any specific project. There's quite a bit of flexibility built into it. There are milestones that the town would need to hit in terms of actions in the plan. But mostly the funding, 75% of the funding is basically, I guess, guaranteed. And then the remaining 25% does depend on the performance of the action plan over time. So that's a bit of an overview. I guess I'll just touch on the comment that was made with regards to the the family member. The idea there is that these are intended to be new units put on the housing market to provide places for people to live, and not sort of be built with a grant and then, you know, kept for, you know, family use or Airbnb or something like that. So this comment in the staff report was really just a general comment, and the intent there was to help get these units on the market. Certainly, I think a situation like this woman described would be perfectly legitimate use of a unit like that. And the intent is not to preclude that. The intent is to just get these units out there and rented in the housing market. And if there's an individual like that that would be in that market, I think that's totally fine. So we'll definitely take that comment to heart. And when the program, if the grant is successful and the program does come back to council, that would be considered for sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Newcomb. I'll turn to members of council. I have on my speaking list Councillor O'Keefe, Councillor Duck, and Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to staff. First of all, I want to commend staff for bringing this forward. I think this is excellent. Several of us, the mayor and Councillor Novak and myself, attended a session on this program at AVICC, and these are great actions that I think staff are bringing forward. One question I had was, I realize that we're kind of under the gun to get this application, and so don't, you know, I imagine we're not wanting to make too many changes to it, but would we have the opportunity to have further discussion, say on the ADU program, if the funding is approved, and we want to have further discussion about maybe an additional amount for accessible units, or some of the comments that were made here today about the pros and cons of family members, because while I recognize staff's point about the reason for these, the reality is that our living arrangements are changing, where, you know, our kids in our 30s, many of them would like to stay and work in Sydney, but they can't find their own place, or and so maybe we should be a bit more flexible. So without wanting to get into a whole discussion on that, I guess my question is, will we have the opportunity to discuss that a bit more when staff brings forward the details on the program?
Yeah, through the mayor to Councillor O'Keefe. I think CMHC has recognized themselves that this is quite a tight turnaround time on a grant application like this, and so they've built in quite a bit of flexibility. They want to see sort of what the broad actions are and some broader milestones for how those actions would be delivered. But the details of the programs, I think they would recognize will come later. A lot of these actions are dependent on future council decisions as well, like through the zoning bylaw, where the council needs to follow a legislative process and make a decision on a change to the bylaw. And so certainly, you know, from the basics of, say, a garden suite program itself, you know, what are the setbacks, things like that, council will need to decide on all of that stuff. And any grant program as well, you know, that involves town funds or money flowing through the town will need to go through council as well. So that will all come, and the details as well, and council will have a chance to review all of that.
Great, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. I'll go to Councillor Duck, Councillor Garnett, and Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. I actually have 4 questions, so if I am allowed, I'll continue through, but please let me know. My first is, and again, congratulations to staff for putting this together. And one of my concerns is that, does staff have the capacity to manage this grant program and all its elements in terms of reporting and following and tracking?
Through the mayor to Councillor Duck. Yes, I feel quite confident that we can manage this. As I stated earlier, a lot of these initiatives, I think, are in the direction of work we would be doing in some sense as part of OCP policy and the economic development strategy directions. It might not look exactly like this, and certainly a lot of things like the grant program are not things that we could reasonably think of financially, I think. Yeah, I think a lot of this stuff, you know, we've put a lot of thought into what could we actually deliver, And I think these are the 7 items we come up with that are sort of, I think, within the realm of our resources. So, yeah, I feel confident we can bring these forward.
Thank you. If I may continue. In the presentation of the application, you've indicated there, you're going to be contacting local nonprofits to see if they can do that. Has there been any preliminary work done with that to sort of establish who might be stepping forward? Because obviously we need to get this going. And second, part B of that is available land.
Yeah, so I think the land question is the larger one. Obviously, it may need to be purchased on the open market, and there's a process that the town would need to go through for that. I have had discussions, informal discussions with a number of nonprofit housing providers over the last several months, and they've essentially indicated that if they are gifted land, for lack of a better term, they can probably bring something forward in terms of delivering a project. What they've said is it quite often depends on, is the land pre-zoned? Are there other subsidies available? What are the DCCs? A lot of, the devil's in the details type of stuff. But I think in broad strokes, what we've suggested in the plan is doable. But definitely some pieces will need to fall in place.
Thank you. Victoria's had a very successful ADU program, and I'm just wondering, in development of this application, have you consulted them to make sure you get the wrinkles out of the way before we get into it?
We haven't consulted with Victoria. The town's had ADUs, or we call them detached secondary dwellings here. We've had them in the Orchard neighborhood for 10 years, a little bit more. And so we've had a couple of projects done there, and through the rezoning process, we've had one recently as well. And I think we're pretty confident that we can put together a good ADU program here as well. In the bylaw, of course, council will need to deliberate and adopt that bylaw. But I think we're confident. And with the zoning bylaw review, we certainly review other municipalities' bylaws and get ideas and try to be somewhat consistent throughout the region as well.
And if I may, my last question. Raised in public participation today was this funding plus funding we have in place and additional resources. There's about $9 million. If we weren't successful in getting this grant, is there an opportunity to continue forward with a similar program that we direct using the funds we already have available?
I mean, if council directs us to undertake a program like that, we'll certainly do our best to deliver it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Duck, and I'll turn to Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to staff. Thank you, Mr. Newcomb. I guess similar lines of staff capacity. One of the criticisms I've heard about the program is that the application process is quite cumbersome, and some people have said it should have been more simplified to get the money out the door faster. So I'm just wanting to make sure that you as a staff, yourself, and those working on it have the capacity to be able to finish and submit the application by Friday. You feel confident you can do that? That's a starting point, right?
I mean, it's going to be a busy week, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think we can get it done.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you. With regards to the speaker and the $1 million, I believe the amenity fund is in and around that range, but I think just over 500,000 of it is actually a affordable amenity. So I'm not sure if we could use the whole $1 million. But one of my questions was, can we use the 500,000 plus towards sort of bringing up the total amount of money? Maybe that's a question for Mr. Hissick.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the balance of the fund off the top of my head, and my understanding is it's council's prerogative of how those funds are used.
Yeah, actually, none of the funds are earmarked for anything anymore since they were rolled together. So it will, in fact, be a council decision as to what you want to use it for.
Okay, so we have that flexibility. Great, thank you. Just two more, if I may. With regards to the accessory dwelling units, I won't say ADU because probably like me, most of the public had never heard of that expression before. I'm wondering with regards to as far as the granting program goes, so as we know, when we include secondary suites in a home or detached or whatever we have you, there's parking requirements. So I'm wondering how we approach that aspect of it with regards to the fact that if they don't have the parking necessary within our zoning bylaw, that could be something could be cost prohibitive for somebody and they may not go forward. So is that something that we would revisit during the zoning bylaw process, or is that something we could do I'm just wondering how we could approach that aspect to make it more feasible.
So the off-street parking and loading bylaw, I don't think currently includes a kind of ADU category, but an additional parking space is required for a secondary suite,
Right.
in addition to one for the main house. There's a clause in that bylaw, I think, that basically says, where the use isn't listed here, you just apply the closest use, which would be secondary suite. So essentially, I think, the number of spaces on the property is set by the bylaw already, which would be one for the ADU. There was a question about, would the town consider secondary suites plus ADUs plus the main dwelling unit on one property? That's a question for council. That's permitted in some places like Vancouver, where I don't believe they have a parking space requirement for the ADU or the suite. I'm not sure about that, but there's a whole range of options that really council could consider to make this more permissive. Of course, if there isn't parking on site, you very much run the risk of parking on street and creating issues there. So it really comes down to when the bylaw is approved, what are the parameters, and what's council comfortable with. So all of that will come forward as part of the zoning bylaw update, and council will have an opportunity to look at it and decide what they think is best for Sydney, I suppose.
Great, thank you. And one more, if I may. The last question, and you sort of touched on it briefly, I think, when you were talking about something else, but how do we ensure, because the goal of this is to provide housing in our community, so how do we ensure that these don't become short-term rentals?
Well, it depends on the unit type. So in the sense of, I guess, say a rental apartment building, that would already be prohibited by the zoning bylaw. Right now, the zoning bylaw does allow where the owner or a long-term tenant is living on the property and the secondary suite is used as a short-term rental, that's fine. If council wanted to ensure that new ADUs are not used as such, there'd be a couple options there. The zoning bylaw short-term rental regulation could be amended. We discussed earlier the possibility of a covenant as part of the grant program regulating how those units are used. That could potentially restrict the use to long-term rental only. But of course, you need a trigger mechanism to get that covenant in place, so which would be the grant. So if you wanted to make sure that on a broader sense, the non-grant ADUs were also not used for short-term rental, the best way to do that would be through the zoning bylaw. So there's various ways it could be done, and that would be something council would have to consider at the time of the zoning bylaw adoption as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett, and I'll turn next to Councillor Novick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First, I'd like to say that I'm extremely gratified to see that staff has gone after this grant program. As Councillor O'Keefe mentioned, we were very excited to see this in Nanaimo when it came out, and I was hoping that the staff would grab onto it. And I think it's a great step towards getting our housing where we want it to be. But I have a few questions, and so please bear with me. The housing action plan that is described in your presentation, was that created specifically to accompany the grant application?
Yes, it was.
Okay. So my next question, corollary to that, would be, would it make sense to have a more comprehensive and expanded housing action plan? And Mr. Mayor, please cut me off if I'm getting too far off track here, but it's all on the same topic. Would it make sense to have a more expansive housing action plan where the Housing Accelerator Fund grant is simply one part of a much bigger program that would allow us to look at possibly additional grants which may be available through various government agencies, and to incorporate some of the programs that provincial government is ostensibly bringing to the housing market. We don't know yet, or at least I haven't seen anything concrete yet. But does it make sense to take this further?
I'm not sure whether the answer to that question is whether it makes sense to take it further. I guess the question I would ask is, do we have the capacity to take it further? This is a very tight turnaround time on this grant program. I think if we are successful in getting the grant, which is a big if, I could see a very busy next 2 to 3 years getting all these things in place, in addition to other work that we're doing. So I think, would it be nice to maybe expand this to a couple other areas? Possibly. I'm not sure that's realistic given the scope of this alone and what it would take to pull this action plan off, if that's fair.
Thank you. I'm not suggesting for a minute that we either slow down or divert the existing application. I agree. I think the deadline is what, October 18th or something? August 18th. Yeah. So yes, let's get that done. I guess my concern is that I don't want us to feel limited by this grant application in saying that, well, this is the only program that we're going to have because it fits the grant application. I think the grant application is great, but it's a fairly narrowly defined program, and I'm sure that we can go beyond it, but be that as it may. My next question has to do with costs, with development costs. With all the emphasis on accessible housing or affordable housing, it's acknowledged that one of the greatest costs for developers are taxes, if you will, or municipal and provincial fees for development. Could range as high as 30% of the development costs in some areas when you include such things as property transfer tax, which is a biggie. The question is the provincial government on board with these programs to develop more affordable housing? And is the provincial government willing to kick in by making some of these fees either go away or deferred or whatever?
Councillor Novick, I will interject for a moment. I think the beginning part of your question was certainly reasonable, but I think you're asking staff for a question where the provincial government may be in its policy. We are certainly all aware, all elected representatives and members of the public and staff aware that the province will be bringing legislation forward this fall, and we will have to await that legislation, which I think will speak to a number of possible initiatives. So, if you could perhaps rephrase your question to this particular grant application, or an aspect of this grant application to staff.
Mr. If I might, just a quick comment on that. The housing action plan that we've detailed here does have a number of sort of built-in initiatives. So in the terms of the grant program for the ADU, one of the options that council could consider there is waiving the fees basically for the building permit and things like that can add up to several $1,000s. Another option that council could consider when and if it happens is, well, anytime an affordable housing project comes forward, council does have the power to waive DCCs, development cost charges. Council also has the power to, I think in the past councils have waived development fees for affordable housing projects. So those options are there. They can be structured as a case-by-case basis or as sort of an ongoing program like has been suggested with the ADU program. So I don't know about provincial fees, but in terms of municipal fees, those options are there for affordable housing for sure.
Fair enough. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I'm done. Thank you.
No, thank you. I just want to take a moment with a couple of questions. One is, we know the grant application deadline is fast approaching. has the federal government indicated when they will be making their announcements on awards, grant awards?
My understanding is early fall, I think September, early October sometime. It's quite a quick turnaround.
Thank you. And thank you to colleagues for your several excellent questions and also for your very positive remarks with regards to staff bringing this forward. It is a very positive announcement. I also want, or very positive work that staff have brought forward. I also want to comment that I'm pleased to see, after several of us did attend the presentation from CMHC at our island conference in Nanaimo, that this program is actually structured such that a municipality like Sydney, which is a small, compact, built-out community, has the opportunity to participate in a very significant grant program. We're looking at roughly $4.5 million, and we know that the much larger cities, whether they're the Torontos or the Vancouvers, will be at the table for this as well. But so I want to thank staff for bringing these. I think it's a good idea in the grant application that you have to have 7 substantial initiatives, to apply. And I want to thank staff for being creative in bringing these. Each one of these individual have positives, but I think there's a synergy in seeing these 7 initiatives together. I did have one more question, and that is, in the application process, is the municipality, are we required to provide some of the other, apart from DCCs or waiving permit fees or development fees, are we advised to indicate or required to indicate other funds that we may have at our disposal to contribute to this housing initiative?
I don't believe so.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Duck for a second time.
Yes, I'd like to move the recommendation, if I may.
Please, go for it.
I move that council approve the town's housing action plan and application to CMHC Housing Accelerator Fund Grant Program for August 2023 intake.
Moved by Councillor Duck, seconded by Councillor O'Keefe. I'll turn to the mover.
I think we've had some good discussion on it, and I want to again kudos to staff for putting this together and bringing it forward. I think it's a great start.
Thank you, Councillor Duck. Councillor O'Keefe?
Yeah, I'll just concur with that. These actions that staff have, as Mr. Newcomb mentioned, there's things that we've kind of talked about before. So I don't think, like, in terms of concern about workload and that sort of thing, I'm not too concerned about that. And I think that if we can do these things, will have, I think, a significant impact on us being able to make some headway with housing in Sydney. So it's very good and very happy to support this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. I'll turn to Councillor Rintoul.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, and I'm very supportive of the housing action plan moving forward and the grant application as proposed. I am in concurrence. I know Councillor O'Keefe followed up on the statements made during public participation from Ms. Jones with respect to Section 4 and excluding non-family members being the target and excluding family members from this ADU incentive program. And I'm concerned with that, but I have heard from staff that we would have the opportunity to revisit that and address it. And I feel like there was probably some consensus and statements up here that that's something that needs to be further visited in time. I will support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rintoul. Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Chair. Sound like everybody's saying the same thing, but I just would also like to thank Mr. Newcomb and staff. When I first saw this on the agenda, I was actually pretty excited, almost giddy. It's been this year 5 of my term, and this is something that I wanted to have happen for the whole time. So I'm very excited about how you've thought outside the box in a lot of areas. It's very, like, the word creative has been used, and very appreciative of that. And also want to recognize the fact that you mentioned in your report, something that I've been saying, is that increasing housing supply isn't always the answer. You have to think, and so I'm glad that that's been recognized in here. And also the $500,000 grant Green Municipal Fund in a climate-friendly housing project for affordable housing, and how important that is, because that's a segment of our population that suffers disproportionately when we have climate effects like heat domes. So the fact that that's in here and the fact that we're looking at that and incorporating that into affordable housing is pretty special and amazing. I'm glad that you thought of that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. And seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question. All in favor? The motion carries unanimous. Thank you to all. And that was our main item of business this evening. We have no motion to go in camera, so I will look for motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Moved by Councillor
Second.
Duck, second by Councillor Novik. All in favor? We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.